You're listening to Messianic Insight, the live podcast from Kehilat Etz Chaim, Tree of Life Congregation in Toronto, with Messianic Rabbi Ben Goldman.
We are going to be talking about Shabbat Shekalim today. It's a remarkable moment which precedes Purim, and Shabbat Shekalim is actually a remnant of it's a remnant of ancient Israel. In a sense, it's like a fossil almost from ancient Israel that takes us back to the days of the temple. Of course, we read about it first in Exodus 30, and we'll talk about that. But Shabbat Shekalim tends to get us talking all about money. And I want to move away from that for a moment. I want to talk about the fact that life is very complex. We talk about a lot of these issues, but they're very much more complex than anyone can ever know. Your life is much more complex. And we have a way of reducing life to things, to stuff, to accomplishments. But your life is much more than that. And indeed, that's the motivation behind every great novel, every great story, every great movie, every great song. It's even the message behind great art, that life is more complex than we can ever communicate simply by what we have and what we've done. Although I always love this story about the great artist who was working on a portrait of Yeshua. And so he brought in a couple of kids off the street. And it was a little boy and her older sister and his older sister. And he says to the kids, what do you think about this man? And he shows them the portrait of Yeshua that he's made. And the two kids look at each other and they look at the picture again. And finally the girl says, well, it looks like he was a good man. And the painter says, thank you very much. Sends them away. Back to the drawing board. Sometime later, he's worked again on his portrait, and he throws open the shutters, and he sees the same two kids out of the street. He draws them back into his studio, and he says, "Tell me what you think of this picture." And the two young children look at each other. They look at this picture, spellbound. And finally, the girl turns to her brother and she says, "Take off your hat. Take off your hat." Life is more complex. Everything is more complex than just what we see. And that is the way it is with money. That is how it is, even in the very final evaluation of life. Let's move to the next slide. I'm just going to say briefly that, not only is life more complex, but when we come down to trying to understand what even a life was all about, I can't help thinking how many times I've spoken eulogies, and I'm going to ask that you mute yourself now, because we can hear somebody in the background. And please mute yourself now. Yes, thank you. I've I've often given eulogies in the past, and you only have a few minutes to grasp hold of what has happened over decades. We read about someone graduating from a certain school, but we skim over the years of doubt and struggle and agonizing questions that have motivated a life. We talk about someone met the love of their life, but we rarely enter into the nuances and the special moments that means. And we speak about faith, but we rarely expose the valleys of the shadow, and rarely do we reveal the secret struggles that people have gone through. And so, as we approach this time, as we talk about Shabbat Shekalim, I want you to realize that we're not just talking about shekels. We're not just talking about what people acquire, what people give. We are talking about something deeper, the call of God to be part of a community, the call of Yeshua on your life to draw close to him as you follow his purpose laid on your life, as God encourages you both through his word and by his spirit. So let's talk a little bit about Shabbat Shekalim and what it's all about. As I was saying to you, it's a fascinating reminder. It begins with the journey of Israel through the desert when they build the first Mishkan, the first Tabernacle, which we'll talk about next week. But here we're talking about the support of the temple in Jerusalem. But to get to understand what that all means, here are some of the coins that you've heard about that are in the gospel. And in fact, there's this requirement, as I was saying, for every male individual, every male in Israel. Traditionally, it was over 20 years old, according to the Exodus chapter 30. Every male was responsible for contributing half a shekel every year to the building of the temple. Now, there was a purpose for this. Obviously, we read about it as well in the history, in the story of Israel, and we read about it in the Haftarah, the necessity to give to maintain the temple, to maintain its upkeep. But there was another aspect of this too. Here, by the way, let's show you some of these coins. You've all heard about them in certain ways. This is the half-shekel here that you can see, this smaller coin. But if you want to get a sense of how large these are, take a look at this person's palm here. It shows you how large, for example, a real denarius was. The shekel here. Here we go. Here's a denarius, by the way. Sorry. There's a denarius. That would be considered worthy of one day's work. The temple tax, particularly, is half a shekel. Now, notice it's worth 2 denarii. So your half shekel is 2 days worth of work for your average person. That's quite a bit. Think about it. 2 days worth of work, giving that away, that's quite a bit of work. That's quite a bit of finances for people who are often very poor. These are the coins that are more familiar to the poor people, by the way, the bronze pruta, and here the little lepton as well. Notice that the lepton is the smallest of the coins, and this is what the widow gave traditionally. It's as little as the pruta is worth, and you'll notice that it was 1/64th of a denarius. The pruta is only half of that. So that's how small the widow's mite's gift was. Let's go on and talk a little bit more about what was going on during this time. Of course, the purpose originally of this half shekel was to maintain this incredible temple in Jerusalem. It was really one of the great wonders of the world when it was built. All marble, all these incredible ornamentations of gold as well. And by the way, not only did it have all these ornamentations of gold, you'll notice that here to one side, there was actually a massive gallery. This was, in a sense, something of a mall area, an interior area. And inside this area, there were various banks. You could go, for example, to a banker here in Jerusalem and bring a note from another banker, a merchant banker in, for example, Alexandria in Egypt or Damascus in Syria, bring a note and change it for money. These were these were the kinds of things that would go on in these specific areas marked out, which were attached to the great temple in Jerusalem. But the issues of money are secondary to this day. Shekalim actually has a very interesting history in terms of Israel's perception of it, because it's specifically given and mentioned here on the first day of Adar. Now, today is the first day of Adar, the month in which we'll celebrate Purim, and there's a reason this is mentioned today, because it was during this month, we read in the scroll of Esther, that Haman put a large gift into the treasury of the king as an act of prestige, so that the king would give him power to destroy the Jewish people. In a sense, what happens here is that the Jewish people say, here on the first day of Adar, we will go before our king and bring our donation first. It's an interesting act. You might say it's a preliminary act of in a sense presumpting the gift of Haman before his king. The most important aspect, though, of this is that we're reminded now, take up the task of upholding the temple. Take up your task to uphold the work of God. Now, the responsibilities are, of course, in some ways a little bit more complex today. We have a responsibility, we know, to uphold our community. We don't give a half shekel. There's no levy. There's no specific demand given on you to give it this very specific amount. And yet, this is a fascinating reminder that there was this moment when it was actually considered a form of atonement. Yes, this was actually a certain form of atonement. I want to point out that there's another aspect to this, especially when we talk about Yeshua. So let's next. I think somebody's interfering with our presentation, but we're going to go on anyway. Yeshua has a very complicated relationship with money. He ate with sinners and tax collectors. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. And he took an affront. And Yehuda, for example, took affront when Miriam anointed Yeshua with a jar of expensive perfume that might have been sold and the money given to the poor. It's a fascinating thing that Yeshua was judged in this way, even as if he, as if he, being the Son of God, could be judged by us, and yet he was. He was judged by others by his by what he had done. Let's keep going. In the temple, you remember he was accosted by an attempt to trap him by the demand whether or not the Torah allowed Israel to pay Roman taxes to Caesar. You remember they attempted to trap him with this question. What was Israel allowed? Thank you, Preeti. Was Israel allowed to? Pay taxes to Caesar? So he picked up a coin and said, "Whose picture is this?" And they answered, "Caesar." And so he gave it to Caesar. So then he said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what belongs to God." Yeshua's relationship with money was complex too. He was judged. He was confronted by this issue as well. Again, we sometimes say that he talked about money more than any other subject. But in actual fact, many of his parables were based on money for a reason. It's because money holds people's attention. We see it in the next slide. All those parables that he talked about related to money, the pearl of great price, the hidden treasure, the prodigal son, the shrewd manager, the workers who go into the vineyard and are all paid the same wages, the story of the talents. By the way, the story of the talents is actually kind of humorous because a talent is more money than a person could ever imagine having in a lifetime. Yeshua spoke about money, but that wasn't his focus, even though he spoke about it often. In fact, his focus was something else indeed. Because Shabbat Shekalim, and let's talk about it a little bit more, is meant to be something that drives us to think about money without focusing on money. Let's talk about the way people in Yeshua's time actually thought about money. Let's take a look at this little story that Yeshua told, and it really helps us understand the way common folk really saw money in Yeshua's time. Let's go to the next slide. It's the story in Luke 15, about the woman who has 10 drachmas and loses one of those valuable coins. And Yeshua says, if you or one of your neighbor loses a valuable coin, like she loses a denarius, won't she light a lamp, sweep the house, search all over until she finds it? When she does find it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and she says, "Come, celebrate with me because I found what I lost." And in the same way, I tell you, there is joy among God's angels when one sinner repents. When Yeshua is talking about this picture, I have to say, this is the way it was for Jewish people in Yeshua's time. This is how they saw money. Every single coin counted. Very few people had much money. And many of the people were poor. We don't often think about that reality. Lots of Jewish people are poor. I myself grew up in a poor Jewish household. Although I never saw my father really take a holiday, he struggled all through my childhood to make ends meet for our family. And I remember one time I said to my mother, how come we're not better off? And she said to me, "Come on, look around. It's the Gentiles who have all the money." So this was what it was like in Yeshua's time. This was the reality. Money was rare. Even paying the half shekel was a sacrifice. For many meant 2 days' labor. And so let's take a closer look at what this passage, the passage inviting us and actually instructing us to give the shekel, the half shekel. What is it all about? Let's keep going. Here we are in Exodus chapter 30. Okay. I sure hope it's all there. I'll read it for us if it's we're having some trouble bringing it up. I'll read it for us. The Lord said to Moshe, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. And then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs. And this half shekel is an offering to the Lord. And the rich are not to give more than a half a shekel, and the poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. And that's a very, we'll hold off on this. We'll go back. And so the interesting thing is the shekel is in essence an atonement. Now, of course, it's a good thing for us to read this and understand that Israel was commanded to give something to participate in the life of the temple, in the life of the tabernacle. And in fact, originally, Rashi tells us that the reason for giving the half shekel was multiple. In fact, part of it was to contribute to the communal offerings that all Israel would make. And in this sense, he said, it made an atonement for us. But in later years, the money itself was actually come to be seen as an atonement. Now, the fact is, since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the sages of Israel have sought out numerous forms of atonement for the sins of Israel. For example, you'll even hear at funerals, the loss of a loved one can be an atonement. Giving money is seen as an atonement when there's no other sacrifice. Acts of charity are atonement. Studying the Torah, the prayers of the righteous. And we do not discount the fact that Israel seeks God's face in favor. But for believers in Yeshua, our effective atonement is only in the blood shed for us on the cursed tree. The ultimate and final sacrifice of Messiah for our lives is our only atonement. But Yeshua paid this temple tax. Or at least he seemed to. So let's take a close look at what he did. So let's take a look at Matthew chapter 17. It's a very, very interesting story. And it's particularly interesting because we need to put it into context. When they came to Kfar Nahum, the collectors of the half-shekel came to Kefa and said, "Doesn't your rabbi pay the temple tax?" And of course he does, said Kefa. But when he arrived home, Yeshua spoke first. "Shimon, what's your opinion? The kings of the earth, from whom do they collect duties and taxes? From their sons, or from others?" Now, I'm going to point out a few things here. And then Yeshua will say, "From others," Kefa will answer. And then said Yeshua, "The sons are exempt, but to avoid offending them, go to the lake, throw out a line, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, you will find a shekel, take it and give it to them for me and for you." Well, let's put this whole story into context. The first thing is, it happens in Matthew 17, where the first thing that happens in Matthew 17 is the transfiguration. The second things that happen are an incident in which the disciples are unable to cure someone who apparently has a young child that is apparently unable to be healed by the disciples, and Yeshua has to intervene. And then finally, the story which we read, in which he tells them they're about to go to Jerusalem, and he will die and then be risen again. And all these other stories kind of overshadow this very minor little miracle about the fish. So it's very easy for this little miracle to get lost in the story. Remember, I was telling you life is very complex. Lots of things in our life stories are lost. And this one is easily lost too. But it doesn't mean it's not important. The story is unique, very unique. Let's step back a bit. And Preeti, let's just go to the previous slide just for a minute, if we can. Thank you. Notice that when they come to Capharnaum, the collectors of the half-shekel come to Kefa. Now, the collectors of the half-shekel are not tax collectors. This is a misnomer because the collectors of taxes could collect as much as they could squeeze out of the people. But the collector of the half-shekel only collects a half-shekel because it's to go very specifically to the temple. And it's very likely that when it speaks about the collectors of the half-shekel, it's probably a couple of men from the community who have been assigned the task, probably by the local synagogue, of collecting a half-shekel from each of the men in the local community, particularly those who belong to the synagogue. Now, why would they do this? The major reason they would do this is because most men, especially in the Galil, who are poor, would not get to Jerusalem during the year. If they did, that would be wonderful. But many of them probably could not afford to make this very long and arduous journey, unless they were very religious. So it was actually a service to the men that they would collect the community. And in all likelihood, two men would go together in order to do this. And the reason would be quite simple, because after all, if you have two men, one checks the other so to keep them both honest. And so notice that they come and they do not speak to the rabbi. They are, I think it's a note of their humility. They don't speak to the rabbi. They speak to the one who is obviously the lead disciple, which is clearly Kefa. And they say, doesn't your rabbi pay the temple tax? Really, because they are approaching the issue with some sensitivity. Of course, they can't say specifically whether or not he has gone recently to Jerusalem or he plans to go to Jerusalem. But Kefa here simply affirms for them, of course he does. But he does not pay it immediately. He could have gone possibly to Judah, who carried the money bag for all of them. Perhaps he could have gone there and sought out a shekel, but he doesn't. He goes to speak to Yeshua because it makes sense. He's going to pay the personal tax for Yeshua, and he wants the master to know what has been requested and to make sure that his master, for example, has not paid it or has perhaps made some accommodation to have it paid for himself. So he comes into his own home where Yeshua is commonly a guest, and in fact, by tradition, had his own room. And as soon as he walks into that house, and it's interesting because, of course, some of you have actually visited what is considered to be Kefa's house in Capernaum. Yeshua speaks to him even before he can talk. It's as if this is on Kefa's mind, and Yeshua speaks to him first. And he says, Shimon, what's your opinion? The kings of the earth, from whom do they collect duties and taxes? From their sons or from others? Now, this is itself an arresting question. What's your opinion? The kings of the earth, from whom do they collect duties and taxes? And Kefa knows the answer to this. Do they collect taxes from their children? No. Preeti, let's go to the next slide. So, of course they don't. From others, of course. And who is Yeshua? Remember what we saw earlier in Matthew 17? The transfiguration. It was that moment which totally affirmed the identity of Yeshua. And what does God say? This is my beloved Son. So here is Yeshua asking him, well, do you think the Son of God now owes the temple tax? Well, Yeshua says, of course, the sons are exempt. But there's something more to this. Do you remember very well how we are described in John chapter 1? You remember what John chapter 1 declares concerning us. As many as received him, as though to those who put their trust in him, he gave the right to become sons and daughters, children of God. So you and I are also exempt. But now, Yeshua says, but to avoid offending them, go to the lake, throw out a line, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a shekel. Take it and give it to them for me and for you. Now, Yeshua does not in any way minimize his identity by paying the tax, nor does he suggest that we should not pay the tax. And by the way, you need to note something very important here, which is not apparent to us from the text. And this is another part of the story. And it's not accessible to us because, you see, after the destruction of the temple, Matthew and his community were reading this story in very different circumstances. And most of us do not know this. After the destruction of the temple, as terrible as that was, the Roman emperor brought down on all the Jewish people a tax, a half-shekel equivalent for every Jewish man, woman, child, and anyone who converted to living according to Jewish practice. So when Matthew was writing this story, people were having to face an onerous tax on their families, which was pressed upon them by the Roman authorities because of the revolts that the Jewish people had done in the Holy Land. And so this story actually is a bit of a comfort for people who lived in the generation following Yeshua. It was a comfort to them because, first of all, Yeshua was saying to them, I know you do not have to pay this tax, but God will help provide for you. That is also written into this story. So when Yeshua says the sons are exempt, he doesn't mean that he won't pay, but he is saying it's not an earthly obligation. In other words, we are no longer under the obligation of this tax for the sake of atonement. And that's the important aspect of this story. We do not need to worry. Although we pay the taxes, although we do pay our taxes, God will provide for us. And he will do it in such a way that the effects of these taxes will not be onerous. They will not weigh so heavily on us that we cannot press on in faith. So this moves us to a very practical part of this parable. And it reminds us of something. First of all, he does not say to Kefa, okay, Kefa, go outside. You'll find that it's been raining shekels. So just go out there, pick one up, and hand it over for us. That's not the way it works. Secondly, he does not reach into his sleeve magically and pull out a shekel and say, here, Kefa, go ahead, pay the tax. That's not how it works either. Instead, he says, go and do what you're used to doing. Go and do what God has called you to do. Go and do what is familiar to you. And God will be with you to bless you. Indeed, God will more than uphold you, even in your circumstances. And the sign of the shekel in the fish's mouth is a sign of God's particular blessing on the believer. After all, a catch of fish might have paid the tax. But finding the shekel in the fish's mouth is a reminder God is with us, even in circumstances that seem onerous. And we live in times that seem to weigh heavily on us. Life is complex. It's not just about the money. It's not just about the pressures we face because we've got financial issues. And in our case, the weight and the hassles of lockdowns. But rather, we know God is with us in circumstances that in certain ways it's almost impossible for others to fully understand. That's not an encouragement, for example, to buy lottery tickets. Years ago, I did a study, and some of you remember that study on people who bought lottery tickets and ended up incredibly unhappy when they became winners. The stock markets, too, are full of people who are so disappointed at what happened because stocks rise and fall. And that's one of the things that I've seen over my lifetime. Some of the most unhappy people are the ones who've focused most wholeheartedly on making money. But what does Yeshua say? Let's go to the next slide. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Yeshua is telling us, know where your treasure is, and don't put it in the wrong place. Our lives are always more complex than how much we have. They're much more complex, and your life is worth more than your bank account. It's worth more than how people have measured you by how much you've made. And I know that feeling. I'm going to tell you a little story. And it's a story that's very complex, a little more complex than usual. And it's a story that I did not include in my book about the Zeidman family, More Than Miracles. And there's a reason I didn't include this story. And I want you to sit back and just listen to how I tell it. Here's the story. One day, Morris Zeidman was on a train going to New York City. As he was walking through the train, he happened to see one of the most famous people in Canada. That gentleman was the president of the T. Eaton Company. Now, at that time, Eaton's was not only one of the biggest stores in Canada, but it was actually one of the biggest companies in all of North America, if not in the world, because you see, in that day, hard to believe because it was moving towards its height, the Eaton Company, even though it was the Depression, was worth close to $1 billion. This was one of the wealthiest companies in the world at the time of the Depression. Morris Zeidman was anxiously trying to feed the hungry and clothe the needy in downtown Toronto. When he saw Eaton, Mr. Eaton, he could not help think what this could possibly mean if somehow he could connect with him. At one point, the train stopped and he got off the train and he got on the phone, was able to get on the phone to his wife in Toronto and tell her, please pray. I don't know what I'm going to do, but somehow I can't help think that this is an opportunity and I don't know how it's going to work out. Well, we do not know how it worked out because somehow the two met. And they had a very, very long and fruitful relationship. And for many years, the ministry of Morris Zeidman was blessed by the T. Eaton Company. But here is how the story was told after Morris was gone. The story was simply told this way. Morris was on a train to New York City, and he was praying, Lord, I need your help. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the president of the Eaton Company would help our mission? And then he looked up, and a gentleman sat down across from him, and Mr. Zeidman looked at him and said, are you Mr. Eaton? And Mr. Eaton looked back at him and said, yes, Reverend Zeidman, I am. How may I help you? That's how the story is remembered. But that is just a shadow of the struggle. It's a shadow of what really happened. My friends, people will look back at these days and they'll say, somehow we got through the tough days. We'll look back and we'll say, yep, we spent days indoors, but somehow we got through it. We will not be able to tell people what it was like to go through it day after day. But they will see by our faith by the character that we show after we have walked through with Yeshua, that he's been faithful. Look at these words which he promises us. Let's keep going. Not only where is your treasure, but do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. All these things will be added to you. Indeed, God will provide for you. And there's one more slide. I want you to remember this. They are words which a dear brother, long gone and faithfully with the Lord now, reminded me, no matter what I went through, my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Messiah Yeshua. And how will he do that? Because, my friends, as Yeshua said of himself, one who is greater than the temple is here. Here, in your heart, your temple. One who is greater than the temple is here. Let's pray. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King. The journey that we walk through, journeys like these days, where we seek to be equipped, where we seek to be strong. No one else will quite understand what it has taken to make it through these days. But Lord, you know what your children have gone through. And you know how we are called to stay faithful. And you will uphold us because our treasure is you. The temple, which Israel thought would stand forever and today, is remnants only of stones and a great wall. That temple is a reminder that unless the Lord builds the house, laborers labor in vain. Let us, Lord, build in you what we cannot build alone. Give us strength to keep on walking, to keep on serving, to keep on believing in Yeshua's name. Amen and amen.